Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Dead Men Tell No Tales as Javier Bardem's Salazar tries to get his revenge on Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow in the latest Pirates of the Caribbean. Henry Turner, played by Brenton Thwaites, wants to break his father's curse, and to do this he needs Jack Sparrow, played by Johnny Depp, to help him find Poseidon's trident. Unfortunately, Jack is down on his luck and has inadvertently released notorious pirate hunter Salazar, played by Javier Bardem, whom Jack outsmarted and is determined to get his revenge upon, enlisting the aid of Barbossa, reprised by Geoffrey Rush, to track him down. With the skills of astronomer Karina, played by Kaya Scaldelario, Jack and Henry must find the trident before Salazar gets his hands on it to lift his own curse. The original 2003 Pirates of the Caribbean shouldn't have worked. It was, after all, a movie based off of a theme park ride, made at a time when Hollywood didn't do movies on the water, following Waterworld and Cutthroat Island, the latter pretty much eradicating the pirate movie. And yet, it worked. For all the people that claimed it was going to be that summer's biggest flop, it turned out to be a huge surprise. I think the major reason that movie works as well as it does is Gore Verbinski's direction. He really brings a high, cartoonish energy and wit to that movie, and it very much embodies its source material. It's a real roller coaster ride in the best sense of the word, and it's a lot of fun to watch, and you can tell that all the performers involved are having a lot of enjoyment out of it, chief among them Johnny Depp. And that was a performance that Verbinski very much had to fight for. Disney executives didn't like where Depp was going with the character and actually considered firing him at one point, but he was kept on, and it turned out to reap huge rewards because he's easily the guy that steals that whole film, to the point where he actually got nominated for a Best Actor Oscar that year. Depp has gone back to that well so many times that a lot of the novelty of that particular performance has kind of diminished over time. You just think of Jack Sparrow as another of Depp's signature weirdo characters, but at the time you didn't see anything like Jack Sparrow on screen. It was genuinely a breath of fresh air, and I think the Pirate series is very much an example of diminishing returns. Each passing entry gets further and further away from what made the first film so good. And I can't say exactly that the fifth film reverses the tide on that. 15 years after the original movie, Dead Men Tell No Tales, or Salazar's Revenge as it's known internationally, feels so very, very tired at this point. Verbinski left the series after the third movie, and for all the sequel's faults, and they are many, I think his absence in the director's chair has created this huge gaping void in the Pirates series, because so much of what worked about the films was his imagination, this very quirky, offbeat style, and if you want to see just how much of an impact he had, go watch the previous sequel, On Stranger Ties, directed by Chicago director Rob Marshall, and he directs it with this very bland, flat style, with no imagination to it whatsoever. It's one of the most boring blockbusters you can think of. So with this entry, I think you can very much tell that what they were trying to do was get closer to what the series was under Verbinski, without actually getting Verbinski back. They very much try to bring back some of the odder, quirkier elements of the Pirates franchise and get it back on track. And you can definitely see that most prominently in the action set pieces, especially in the opening one. We're reintroduced to Jack Sparrow in this sequence where they're stealing a bank, and I don't just mean the actual safe. They screw up and they end up pulling the entire bank behind them on horse-drawn carriage, and that is the sort of unusual offbeat action that would have happened in a Verbinski movie. However, their style of direction is not Gore Verbinski, because Gore Verbinski wouldn't keep cutting away to Karina, who is also introduced in this sequence, and what she does in it is far less interesting. And what that means is that the tension and excitement and humour of that sequence is quickly allowed to dissipate, unfortunately. And that's generally what's representative of the movie, in that it sort of feels like Pirates of the Caribbean of old, but not really as fresh or as really as sharp as the first movie. It very much had a certain amount of punch to it, whereas this kind of feels like just another go around. There is another gag in the movie that is definitely worthy of being in the first 3 films, involving a guillotine. That particular gag is so off the wall that it really does stand out from the rest of the movie, unfortunately, because you kind of wish that it had that kind of energy to it. The problem with this 5th Pirates movie, to avoid using its alternate subtitles to confusing effect, is that this entry feels very much like a compendium of everything that we've seen before in these Pirates movies in terms of its plotting and structure. So much of it is stuff that I could say, oh, that's from a previous movie, that's from a previous movie, that reminds me of that. You can definitely see this with Karina, who is almost certainly the new Elizabeth Swann, because she has all the same characteristics. She's this headstrong, very fiercely independent young woman who feels like an outcast because she doesn't fit society's norms. In this case, society actually thinks she's a witch because of her intellectual pursuit, namely astronomy. And you can tell what the filmmakers are trying to do here. They're trying to recreate the romance between Will and Elizabeth that was the emotional core of the first 3 movies. It wasn't Jack Sparrow, he was just a sideshow that became the main attraction. The problem with trying to do that, though, is that I always felt that romance element was the weakest part of the Pirates movies. It always slowed the films down, and honestly, it felt a little bit drippy. And I certainly felt that way when I saw it being reenacted by its carbon copy counterpart. And that's not meant to be a dig on Kaya Scodelario. I actually think she does perfectly well in this movie, in that she very much has this tenacity to her, and she very much embodies that sort of intellectual pursuit of the character very well. I think in some ways she's actually better in this movie than Keira Knightley was in some of her appearances. And I think she has the right amount of poise for the character. It's just that she doesn't really work with her co-star. No, the problem is a Turner. We all lamented how wooden Orlando Bloom could be at certain points in the original films. Boy howdy, do we have that embodied again here by Brenton Thwaites, the Australian actor who is the son of Will Turner. He's about as wooden as the ships in this film. He's not a memorable character in his own right. Yes, he's got his quest of trying to free his father's curse, is what pushes the plot along in its own way, but he's just so bland. He actually makes Orlando Bloom look actually like Johnny Depp by comparison. I know the Pirates movies are not exactly known for their watertight plots, especially the sequels, which are big gigantic messes, but even by those movies, the 5th film is chock-a-block full of holes, distractingly so. At certain points you go, wait, what? Why were? It's because the film pulls so many things out of thin air and just expects you to just take them on at face value. For example, how Salazar is freed in this movie is just bewildering. So Salazar is a ghost and he lives in the cave that he died in because it's cursed or something, and he's freed because Jack trades his compass, which points to whatever you desire, for rum in his own desperation. And apparently this is a really bad thing. He betrayed his compass. Nice metaphor. So apparently when you do that, you have to face your greatest fear. I don't understand how that works. We've never established that as being a feature of the compass in any of the previous films. You've just retconned that straight out of nowhere. And considering that Jack has given away the compass to people on several different occasions in the previous film, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's like they couldn't figure out a way of getting the plot to move forward, but they just put it in anyway. And much of the film is like that. It's full of elements that just sort of suddenly appear without a lot of explanation. Salazar's crew, for example, they're ghosts, and they look uncannily like Barbossa's zombified undead crew, and that's not a coincidence, because the other trait they have is they can't step on land. I wonder where I've seen that before. Oh right, that's Davy Jones's whole shtick. They bring that back, and with Davy Jones it sort of made sense. In this movie, it's just suddenly there, I guess. They just can't follow them on land. Why? Suddenly Salazar, later in the movie, develops powers that really would have helped him earlier on if he was actually required to use them, but no, he's just going to just allow himself to just forget these powers until they're convenient. I think some of it is to do with the fact that the pirates' mythology at this point is so convoluted that it's hard to really remember all the things that were still in play from the previous movie. Like, for example, you might have forgotten that in the previous film, the Black Pearl was inside of a bottle by Blackbeard. That's brought back this time. That was a stupid idea in the first place, but it's still here this time. You might also recall that at the end of that movie, Barbossa inherited Blackbeard's ship and his sword, but the film only remembers that when it needs to solve a particular problem. It also manages to forget the fact that Barbossa's sword actually had magical powers in that it can control ropes. Again, something that Barbossa could have used at several points in the movie, maybe at least to establish that it was still there, but no, it's completely forgotten. And at least some of this can be attributed to the fact the film has a different writer this time out. It's not the usual series writers. This time, it's Jeff Nathanson, and he really does a botched job on this movie. It just feels like it's so many things just rehashed, just for the sake of them. There's a Norrington-esque character in this movie, played by David Wenham, and I genuinely wondered, why are you even in the movie? He ends up being this third party that tags along on the Trident trip, and then they just discard that particular plot line so quickly, you wonder, why do they include it? The movie's so bloated with different characters and things that it has to reprise from previous entries. Why have we got this new character that does nothing? Nothing at all! The film goes out of its way to bring back performers from past Pirates movies, but honestly, it does feel like their commitment to the roles is wavering a bit. They've been playing these characters for 15 years now. You can understand if they're getting a little bit tired of it. Chief among them is Geoffrey Rush. He's always been a very consistent part of these Pirates movies. I think he's the most underrated element because he's having so much fun in that role. But here, it does feel like his heart just isn't in it anymore, unfortunately. I think that's to do with the way the character's written in this movie. He's playing an older version of Barbossa. The script doesn't really have a good reason for why Barbossa is actually in this movie to begin with. He just sort of enters into the action because he's a pirate. I guess he's going to go on a pirate adventure now. Why does he follow after Salazar? Why does he get involved in this personal squabble between Jack Sparrow and Salazar? Why does he ally himself with him? Why does he help him out? There's no reason why he would do that. He has nothing that he could offer with Salazar. It makes no sense from a plot level to do that. It's again an example of the script making things happen without understanding the logic of why they would happen. But that's nothing compared to Johnny Depp. This is what happens when you do a photocopy far too many times. Depp's shtick has very much outstayed its welcome, I think. We've got far too used to it, both in other movies and in the other pirate films. He doesn't really seem like he's involved with the film at certain points. I actually found him to be quite annoying in this movie. He wasn't actually funny anymore. He was just an irritation, and the film seems to just sort of keep focusing on him unnecessarily. There's this whole set piece where he has to get wed. That suddenly happens. I'm like, why do we need this scene in the movie? It just slows things down. And he's just obnoxious in this entry. He's not amusing anymore. It's just so tiresome to have him around. He's become, instead of something that really carried the series along, he's become this lead weight on it. It doesn't help that Jack is actually written quite out of character in this entry. He's meant to be this character that plays the fool so that he's deliberately overlooked, and then he hatches a cunning plan right underneath your nose that you hadn't suspected. That's the whole point of Jack Sparrow's character. That appears to have been completely lost on the writer of this movie, because in this film, he's just a total idiot the whole time. When you think about it, Jack Sparrow is a static character. We've had 5 films now, and he's a character that's grown nothing whatsoever. He starts out as a pirate, he remains a pirate. Barbossa has had more character growth in 5 movies than Jack Sparrow. You need character growth in a character in order to keep them interesting, to keep it fresh. It's the same thing every time with Jack Sparrow. And unfortunately, the effects of that are becoming all too apparent by this point. And I think Depp himself couldn't be more bored. He's clearly phoning it in at certain points, because all he has to do in these movies now is pretty much just wander around doing his, flailing, waggling posture and just go, savvy. What it does have in common with the fourth movie is that it's this big, expensive blockbuster that on paper seems to have everything you could possibly want from it. It's got explosions and battles at sea, and there's chase sequences and special effects and zombie sharks. It's throwing all this stuff at the screen, but for all the Jerry Bruckheimer bombast, as it did so, I found myself being less and less engaged with the action. It's also empty and hollow because it feels so past its sell-by date. And honestly, the revenge movie plot wasn't engaging me either, because we've been down this road in the franchise as well. Salazar himself, as a villain, he feels very much like an amalgamation of Barbossa and Davy Jones. And Javier Bardem, he's a great actor, I like him as a performer, but there's not much he can really do with the part. He's weighed down by the fact that he's got all these special effects around him and that he's basically playing floaty hair McCracked face, and he's got an intimidating look about him, but the character himself, he doesn't really come across as being particularly threatening or intimidating a lot of the time. It's just not a character that I was hugely invested in, and it doesn't help that it feels so much like Bardem is recycling his performance from Skyfall as Silver, who was a similarly revenge-motivated villain. He's just swapped one franchise for another in this case. He was a deformed villain in that movie, and he was a deformed villain in this one. And it very much feels like a worry on my part that Bardem could be pigeonholed into these kind of villain roles. He's getting a little bit close to being typecast as stock villain, and Bardem is so much better than that. And this whole backstory between Sparrow and Salazar, that leads into a flashback about their first encounter, and that proves to be a major mistake, because you know what we weren't asking about Jack Sparrow? We weren't asking what his backstory was. We weren't asking what the origin of his name was, but apparently the movie feels the need to explain where the Jack Sparrow character came from, and that you didn't need to know those things again, because he's such a fully formed character that actually knowing those things makes him considerably less interesting. So in an attempt to try and make the character a little bit different in this outing, they've actually made him even less interesting than he was in the previous outings, which exacerbates the problem of the character of Jack Sparrow in the first place. On a final note, I saw this movie in its 3D presentation. Don't go and see it like that. Clearly Disney didn't learn anything from the last Pirates movie that was shot in 3D, but was almost impenetrably dark because so much of it was shot at night. The same problem happens in this movie. The lighting of the Pirates series means that there's a lot of low light conditions that are lit by candles or torches that don't play towards the 3D format, and I noticed very little, if any, effects. The only thing I really noticed was the ghost's hair would float out of the screen a little bit. Otherwise, it feels like a cash grab, and that's what this movie feels like. It feels like a last attempt to squeeze what's left from the cash cow. If you're a fan of the series, you'll definitely want to stick around for the post-credits scene, and despite Disney advertising this as being the final adventure, it definitely isn't. They are so setting up for another bunch of sequels. They very much have an eye on the Fast and Furious franchise. That's where they're planning to take the direction of the series. I don't want them to. That feels like a threat. They've done everything with this series at this point. This is a movie that so cannibalizes the earlier films that it makes plain that they are running on fumes at this point. The best thing that they could possibly do with the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise is put it out to sea, because it really does feel like it's desperate. Even the MacGuffin of this movie, of Poseidon's trident, feels like one of exhaustion. It feels just like it doesn't really fit with the rest of the series, and it's understandable if audiences come out of this movie feeling very sea-weary. Pirates of the Caribbean 5, however you want to call it, reuses and recycles so many elements from the previous films that it feels like a greatest hits compilation with only half the enthusiasm. Although it's a slight step above the tedious On Stranger Tides, it doesn't nearly match the manic energy and invention of Gore Verbinski's entries, but still feels bloated and convoluted, with the plot not making a lot of sense even by this series' standards. The newbies are blandly reenacting Will and Elizabeth, while the remaining cast members, including Geoffrey Rush, seem to be here out of a sense of obligation, with Johnny Depp's shtick as Jack Sparrow being an especially half-hearted pastiche of what was genuinely anarchic and different in the first entry, although the fact that he's written as more of an idiot than a cunning oddball doesn't help. Despite having the big set pieces and explosions you'd expect, it's more numbing than exciting, making for especially tough sailing on an audience still riding on affection of earlier entries. This feels like a franchise that has been well and truly plundered, and it may be time to let it set sail into the horizon once and for all. If you like this review, you can support my work and see them early over at my Patreon, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.